What's the definition of money today? Well, it's basically whatever it is that the government forces us to trade as a medium of exchange. So we have conceded to government that government can literally decree its paper scrip. Inflation is the counterfeiting of credit. And this is a counterfeiting. This is a monetary fraud. This is fundamentally dishonest. Does it work? Well, no, it doesn't work, but they're getting away with it. So today, if they retroactively declare the dollar is worth this much gold or the euro is worth this much gold, it's just a price fixing scheme. Every central bank or government price fixing scheme ever, without any exceptions, has always failed.
Welcome to the Macroscopic Podcast presented by Gold Republic. My name is Alexei Juranov, and in this format, I invite you to look at the world through different lenses to see what's hidden in plain sight. We'll dive deep to understand the forces that drive macroeconomics, financial markets, and the nature of money with alternative assets like gold, silver, and cryptocurrencies. We'll also investigate how geopolitics and power games shape the world we live in, but also what can we learn from history to understand the present and prepare for the future. This week, I have the pleasure to welcome Keith Weiner, CEO and Chairman of Monetary Metals and a PhD from the new Austrian School of Economics, with a reputation for having atypical views on the economy. As the founder and president of the Gold Standard Institute USA, Keith's efforts were pivotal in the historic passing of gold legal tender laws in Arizona in 2017. His influence extends globally, having engaged with central bankers, legislators, and key government figures. In this conversation, Keith discusses why he believes that the current fiat system is based on the biggest counterfeit operation in history. We examine why Keith believes that the gold standard and commodity-backed currencies won't work, and the need for a gold-based system. On the other hand, we explore the possibilities of avoiding the growing debt crisis through gold-backed bonds. Next to that, Keith shares what he thinks are the pitfalls of the Keynesian School of Economics that dominate our financial system, and why he believes that the quantity theory of money is an outdated relic. As a thank you gift, we'd like to give you 1 free gram of gold worth 60 euros if you open an account at Gold Republic. Just click on the link in the description. We hope you'll get fresh insights and enjoy this conversation. If you do, please give it a like and subscribe. Leave your reactions in the comments and share it to those who need to hear this. Welcome to the podcast, Keith.
Thanks for having me.
Is what I just said accurate, or would you like maybe to amend or add things?
So in Arizona, it started out as a gold legal tender bill. And every year that it got vetoed, it was vetoed 3 times by 2 different Republican governors. And 1 year it didn't get out of committee, and then finally it passed, which was the year Ron Paul came down to testify on behalf of it. The final one that got passed says nothing about legal tender anymore, unfortunately. It just simply removes the state level capital gains taxes on gold and silver, which is a worthy accomplishment, but it does fall slightly shy of gold legal tender. So Utah has a gold legal tender bill. And I think there may be 1 or 2 other states that have that sort of language, but unfortunately Arizona does not.
Yeah, the Utah one is, if I'm not mistaken, the gold back, right?
Yeah, so that's a private company and a private product, but the state law actually, recognizes gold as legal tender and directs the courts specifically to enforce any gold clauses that may be in contracts that come under dispute before the courts, which is interesting. And as far as I'm aware, that's the only state that has specifically directed its state courts to do that.
Okay, so it's more of like a manner of basically settling any disputes than with gold, if I understood it properly.
If the contract provided for gold in the first place. So they're very clear that if the contract contemplated dollars, then it's a conventional contract not to do anything differently, not to try to force gold settlement on debtors that didn't agree to it. But if the contract, both parties agreed, then yes, the courts are supposed to honor whatever it says about gold.
Okay, that's interesting, and I think that we should keep that as a reference point for like some other moment in the conversation. Because I first want to start with some, let's say, basics, but also more about yourself. I like to ask this question, and this is the following question: is what is your most heretic opinion regarding the current monetary system?
Where I'm a blasphemer, a traitor against the system. The most heretical, I think I would say, only gold is money, nothing else. I'll go with J.P. Morgan, who said that before Congress in 1912 in his testimony. I think that would be my most heretical. Gold is money. The dollar is not money. It's credit, and it's irredeemable credit, and it's counterfeit credit, and it's credit of dubious and failing quality. That's pretty heretical.
All right. Yes. I mean, I I can see why it is. So basically, if I understood correctly, this whole system is a dubious system. If I base it on your statement.
So there's 4 elements to what makes credit legitimate. 2 of them are the lender, and 2 of them are the borrower. So the lender has to know he's extending credit. The lender has to agree to the terms of the credit, and the borrower, on the borrower side, the borrower has to have the means to repay and the intent to repay. So imagine if, just to try to find a way of violating all 4 of those, imagine that your 12-year-old kid sneaks into your bedroom when you're sleeping and takes 100 euro out of your wallet without you knowing. So you don't know about it. And then he says, no, it's okay. I'm not stealing from my dad. I'm just borrowing. So you didn't know and you wouldn't have approved because he's borrowing for what? So that he can buy drugs. Mm. And so he buys the drugs. He does the drugs. He doesn't have the means to repay it because he's just consumed it. And he doesn't really have the intention. He's just getting high. He's not doing anything productive with it. So if that was the situation, I think most people would recognize that's not borrowing, that's stealing. You know, maybe you don't, I mean, as your own kid, maybe you don't send him to jail, but, you know, clearly you have to sit down and have a very uncomfortable conversation with this young man and say, don't be doing that anymore, or I'm going to kick you out of my house, or whatever it is you do. Mm-hmm. That's the unfortunate situation we have with what's called money today. It's credit. People don't realize they're lending to the government. If you hold euros, if you hold dollars, you're lending to the government. You don't know that, and you wouldn't agree to the terms. Most people realize that the governments are profligate spenders, and the government has neither the means nor the intent to repay. Mm-hmm. It's just an endless game where every time the debt comes due, then they borrow more money to pay off the old debt. So imagine you have a credit card debt that you can't pay, but you have a new credit card offer in the mail. So you open a new credit card and get a cash advance to pay off the old credit card. This is not honest, finance. There's something screwy about it. Mm-hmm. And so that's my definition of inflation. Inflation is the counterfeiting of credit. And this is a counterfeiting. This is a monetary fraud. This is a fundamentally dishonest thing that they're doing. And, does it work? Well, no, it doesn't work, but they're getting away with it.
In that sense, like the system is deemed, actually, it's, if you bring it down, it's a matter of trust, right? Like if trust is kind of the governing principle of money, which you claim only gold is, then there's basically no more trust in the system. And thereby, there is no actual long-term viability of it. And one of the things that you've just mentioned is also the concept of inflation that you think is counterfeiting money, which I also found back in kind of the compilation you made about your series about anti-concepts. And I was wondering, when we look at, for example, you made a reference in the introduction of that series, which I thought was pretty fascinating because I think you can apply this to many more things than just the financial system. You can look at it on a social level, on all kinds of ways, is George Orwell painting a picture of a world in his book 1984 about a world that is very dystopian, and in a setting where totalitarian governments three blocks basically pretend to fight each other to just keep control over the whole planet. But most importantly, they control the definitions of the words that matter. And I think that's striking because there's words we use every day and we do not really know or really realize first what they mean and what was their initial maybe meaning or definition, etymologically speaking, and thereby also use of it. What is for you one of the most important concepts, or in that sense, anti-concepts within economics, which are misunderstood or even false?
Well, today, to take the word money itself, what's the definition given by the government? And I call them the court economists. That they exist to serve their master, and they get grants or employment or whatever. What's the definition of money today? Well, it's basically whatever it is that the government forces us to trade as a medium of exchange.
Mm-hmm.
So we have conceded to government that government can literally decree its paper scrip, and which is a counterfeiting operation, as we just said a moment ago. So it's dishonest, credit paper that the government decrees that not just to, see, here's the problem with anti-concepts. If I say to you that the government's credit is honest, let's say, you can evaluate that proposition and you can come to the conclusion, well, it's not. But the thing that makes an anti-concept so powerful and so deadly is it embeds the proposition in the definition, and the proposition goes unexamined. So if the government says, this is money, and it's a euro that says 20 on it, it's much harder to claim. Obviously, that thing has a value of 20 euros. So what is that? That will buy you 10 liters of petrol, something like that, I'm guessing. It'll buy food, it'll buy all these things. So it forecloses on any conversation around, well, wait a minute, how did this get to be money? What is the definition of money? What is the etymology of money? And so on. I was at and this problem is very pernicious, and it affects even the Austrians. So I was at an Austrian School Economics conference for academics. This is mostly professors of economics that adhere to the Austrian school, and it was put on by an economics department in Europe. I don't want to name too many names here publicly, but it's a university economics department where the chair happens to be an Austrian school guy. And they were absolutely saying that the dollar, the euro is money. And so I was the second speaker of the day. The first speaker said only gold is money. And unfortunately, his presentation was mostly pictures of old historic gold coins, mm-hmm. which is not interesting economically. It's interesting historically and they're pretty, but it wasn't that interesting economically. Anyway, they absolutely, as soon as he was done with his talk, they ripped him, as we say in America, they ripped him a new one. I was just biting my tongue that, I was going to make the same point. So I stood up and I said, there comes, in every era, there's a question hanging in the air, screaming out, demanding to be answered. And I said, in the time of Copernicus, that question was, if you really think that the planets go forward in their orbits and then backwards a little bit and then forward some more and then backwards, how do you explain the retrograde motion? And of course, if everything orbits the sun, then the explanation is very simple. It's just our vantage point of looking at the other planets is not that's why they appear to have a retrograde motion. And I said, there's a question today that's hanging out in the air. And I said, you don't owe me an answer. I'm just some annoying American. I'm going to get on a plane tomorrow and go back to America and leave you be. You owe yourselves an answer, and you owe yourselves an answer that is a rigorous answer. And that question is, and I had a picture of a 1870s bank teller window. It was all ornate brass and everything, very Victorian, And I said at that time, and I had a picture of a $20 bill. If you were to pass the $20 bill to the teller through the window, then the teller would give you this gold coin that had approximately 1 ounce of gold in it back, with no words being necessary. Everyone would understand the transaction implicitly. And I said, here's the question that's screaming to be answered. If the word for the piece of paper is money, then what is the word for the gold coin that comes back to you? Nobody had an answer. It was dead silence. All the same people that were piling on and beating up on the previous speaker for what he said. I said the same thing, but I said it in a different way. And because you need different words for different things. That piece of paper, it's imagine you go to a fancy restaurant and you have a big heavy coat and you check your coat. You give your coat to the clerk and they have a little room where they hang the coats and they give you back a little piece of paper, right? That's your coat check, receipt. We have a different word for coat check receipt than we do for coat. They're not the same word. And nobody would think that if it's cold and wet outside, that you can put this thing on and wear it, and then it's going to protect you from the rain and the cold. But we've lost that distinction when it comes to money. There's a piece of paper that is evidence of a debt that the issuer owes you the gold when it's presented this piece of paper on demand. But that isn't the same thing as the money itself. And all of that has been completely lost today. And so today, the definition of money is whatever the government of Eurasia tells me money is, then that is what, oh yes, money, that's right, this is money. And it's not. It doesn't work like money, but people use it as if it's, attempt to use it as if it's money, and the result is the malaise that we have in our world today.
I think it reminded me as well, like one time a professor that just said that. He said, can you tell me the difference between money and currency? And I think the whole classroom was totally like lost. Like, yeah, well, what do you mean currency and money is the same thing, right? Euro is money and money is euro. And actually he said, you know what, come back in a week, do some research, and then answer me this question again. And it really opened my brain in different ways. I really started seeing the nuances that currency does not necessarily mean money. Money could be, in certain form, be under the form of currency, but it's not always the case. And in the case of gold, we've seen, like, with the evolution of money throughout the last thousands of years, with debt being in the beginning and now having like the euro, the dollar, and all those fiat currencies, it kind of begs to ask as well, what will be the money of the future if gold cannot be the money of today? Like, are we doomed to be basically in a moneyless system? Can gold maybe become money again in the system?
So there's a quote that I love from Winston Churchill. Whatever you think of the guy, he certainly could be obnoxious. And I understand that on the continent of Europe, there's kind of a love-hate relationship. There were some things that you like about him and some things you don't. But he was witty, and he's famous for several quotes, but one of which is, he said, God bless the Americans, because after they've tried everything else, they'll do the right thing. This is Winston Churchill. And I think in that spirit, I would say God bless the world, because after it's tried everything else, it will do gold, because only gold, really works. And we're in a failing monetary system today because the euro and the dollar aren't working. And they're obliged to issue ever more of it to fix the problems of, in a certain sense, it's a scarcity. I love the quote, a very ironic quote from Milton Friedman, where he said, if you put the government in charge of the Sahara, pretty soon there'd be a shortage of sand. And I'm like, yeah, and Milton Friedman wanted the government in charge of money. And now pretty soon there's a shortage of it. And that's the problem, is everybody's in debt up to their eyeballs and don't have enough to service their debt. And ironically, the more that they issue of this so-called money, the greater the problem becomes, until the system eventually eats itself and collapses. So we're going to be going back to gold. And there's two ways, which is either total collapse of the world or a more graceful, transition. And that's what monetary metals, that's what my whole aim is with this, is to give the world a graceful transition where we can move gradually and without, collapse and catastrophic failure and all of the things that come with that, strife and killing in the streets and desperation and, hunger and, misery. How do we get there, the peaceful way?
Well, that I think would be obviously the nicer option. In some of your papers, you actually talk about the quantity theory of money, and I was wondering because it's considered a relic and has been debunked multiple times, but then why does it still hold such a prominent place in mainstream economics?
I think it's terribly convenient. Um, I'll use an example. So I define a term that I call useless ingredients. And I thought of this term when I was either reading about or I was at a gas station, a petrol station. And in the United States, at least, I don't know what it is in Europe. There's a sticker on there that says between April and October, this gasoline contains up to 15% MBTE, methyl buta tetraethylene, I think, but don't quote me on that. I'm not a chemist. An MBTE adds cost, and I think it's something like 25 cents a gallon in cost, but it doesn't add anything of any benefit to the driver of the car. In fact, I think you get worse fuel economy with it. So it not only makes a gallon more expensive, but you actually get less power and less mileage out of it for having it. And I thought, well, this is a useless ingredient. This is something that nobody would put in there other than the government forces you to put it in there. And in most cases, I think in that particular case, consumers know because every gas pump in America has that sticker. But in most cases, people don't even know about all the useless ingredients that go into all the products they have. But that relentlessly drives prices upwards. Then on top of that, in recent years, you have green energy restrictions, especially in Europe. My God, what Europe has done to energy has just been gobsmacking to watch, from the US. Then you have tariffs and potentially a trade war. So in the United States, we started putting tariffs on everything from imported Chinese steel to imported lumber from Canada, imported Scotch whiskey from Scotland. They started slapping tariffs on everything. And again, this all drives prices up relentlessly. And I think having a monetary scapegoat is very convenient. I call this the greatest sleight of hand ever, where everyone sees, everyone understands, California just added another 20 cents per gallon tax on gasoline. And initially they know that gas is more expensive because of the tax. But 2 years later, when they're measuring CPI, consumer price index inflation, they just take into account, gasoline is up this much and this is up this much. And they have an average macroeconomic, aggregate that says inflation is at whatever percent. And everyone knows because Milton Friedman gave them the dogma that they recite, the canon they recite every day before dinner, that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. It has to be. And so they believe it and they think, that's right, the Fed and the ECB created this inflation by printing too much money. And so all the anger is directed away from the politicians who created these stupid policies and towards the central bank. Now, with the central bank, you have this very complicated debate. It's a macroeconomic debate that most people's eyes glazes over. And, on one side, you have people giving differential equations. On the other side, people making other arguments. It's he said, she said, and my equation versus your equation. And the average consumer walks away and just says, this is intractable. And then they go and have a pint of beer. And there's no resolution to it. And meanwhile, there absolutely are stupid, idiotic policies that if you repeal those policies, consumer prices would come down. And but because it's all directed at the central banks, I think it's very convenient for everybody to believe this. And so with these anti-concepts of money and these bogus theories, it's all very self-reinforcing. And people have a view that appears to be internally consistent and supports itself. And it's convenient, it's supported by the government and its court economists because it props up the current political order. And so these are the kinds of things that make the world go round in its irrational ways.
So actually, we're also because you're from the Austrian School of Economics, and I was wondering, what do you think is, when we look at the economy today, which is steered mainly by Keynesians in general and their perspective on the economy, What is for you, in that sense, the biggest pitfall in that way of thinking, the way Keynes sees an economy function?
I was going to say, I think if you look at Jay Powell, he would adhere to the monetarist or the Milton Friedman view, and of course the Friedmanites regard themselves as totally the opposite of the Keynesians, and I regard them as two different stripes of the same species of bird. They're not very different. What's the biggest pitfall of the whole thing? It's the promise of something for nothing. It's the promise that we have some magic and we say abracadabra and we have Eye of Newt and we go out under the Midsummer's Eve moon at midnight and we stir this together and we sacrifice a virgin or whatever it is we do. And this is going to give the government and the people, something for nothing, free goodies. That's the most pernicious thing, and that's why so many people support it. When the government has to tax you to give you something for free, it's unpopular. Mm-hmm. There's only so much that people will tolerate in taxes, and there's been a lot of studies that if they raise the tax rate, first of all, they don't get more tax revenue, and secondly, people get angry and protest, and then you have another election, and the opposition party gets into power. So people are angry about taxes. So what in the 20th century they discovered is, let's borrow instead of tax. Let's borrow to spend rather than tax to spend. And if you borrow, then people can feel like, well, there isn't really a real cost. All we have to do is pay the interest to service the debt. We don't actually have to pay the debt back, which is, of course, the interest is much lower. And so it's the illusion of something for free. And that is extremely destructive, but extremely appealing. Most people like that idea. And, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say a great part of the economics profession exists to come up with all of the mumbo jumbo to justify this. Are you familiar with the idea of a cargo cult?
No.
What happened after World War II on some of these Pacific islands? So the United States Army, I think it was called the Army Air Corps during World War II, had used some of these little islands in the Pacific Ocean as a base where they would flatten a landing strip, right? And they'd put in some lights, and then they could bring in airplanes, and then they could stage supplies, let's say, so they could supply the sailors and the Marines and the soldiers that were getting towards Japan as they were hopping through these islands. Mm-hmm. And so they, when they set up these airstrips and they had to unload the planes and everything else, they used the local islanders as labor, and they would pay them in like cans of food and, battery powered flashlights, or what you call torches, and all these things. And so for the islanders, this was unimaginable riches, right? I mean, if you're just living, you're a little subsistence fishing village on a tiny little island of, 15 square kilometers, right? And what's your food is basically coconuts and fish. And somebody comes along and gives you canned, meat and canned this and, whatever, and flashlights give you light at night. This was riches to them. This was fantastic. They loved it. So when the war was over, the U.S. Army pulled away and, left, and that was it. And so they developed some of these islands developed these cargo cults where, so to them, they knew the word cargo. The plane would land and bring a cargo, and they got some of the cargo. So they went through these elaborate rituals where the U.S., the radio operators that were bringing the planes in had headsets, just like the one you're wearing. Mm-hmm. And so they would put on, they'd fashion something out of coconut shells and little vines. And then they would have guys on the landing strip with flashlights to summon the plane in. So they sent guys out with tiki torches. And so they went through sort of the motions as they understood it with their primitive Stone Age, culture. They went through the motions of what they thought they saw the Americans going through. They thought the Americans were summoning the cargo out of the sky, not understanding that this whole thing was obviously planned and coordinated and, took enormous resources, none of which these islanders could see or understand. So these were cargo cults, and those cargo cults lasted for decades, maybe still ongoing in some of these places, I don't know. And so I use the term cargo cult to describe modern monetary theory, but I think it it applies almost as well to Keynesian economics. It's this idea that by going through these motions that don't make any sense, it's irrational, that it's going to give us something for free, something that we didn't produce or didn't earn, the right way. And that's my answer to your question. What's the most pernicious effect of a belief of Keynesianism? They can give you something for nothing, that you can stimulate consumption with they don't ask the question. I mean, the Austrian school, the first question is what precedes? As a production precedes consumption, or does consumption create production somehow? And the Austrians are the only school that really are explicit in saying you must produce first before you consume. And the Keynesians have all this mumbo jumbo to, supposedly work around it.
It's pretty much like, it's fundamentally different. And also I think then it joins on to like the next question about then what you can spend. Basically, you can afford what you can only spend what you can afford. That's pretty much like the bottom line, if I understood correctly. And I think I've seen a bit of that approach as well in your answer when you formulate. You wrote an essay or an article about gold bonds, which I thought was pretty fascinating. It was already back in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, where you lay down a way to basically escape from the immense debt that the system is leveraged on through a more, let's say, a transition, like a phase of transition where you would exchange government bonds against gold bonds. And I think it was a very refreshing idea because I've never came across this. And I was wondering if you could maybe say a few things about it, about first, what is a gold bond and how would that work, and how do you envision it to be basically a possible solution to end or to actually minder the debt cycle?
So the very first thing to say is that we have so much debt that it's absurd to think it could ever be repaid. I mean, the United States is now going on 32 trillion in debt, and that would be something like $100,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country, and growing exponentially. It's growing much faster than the population. But of course, children don't work and retirees don't work. And so when you look at the people who work in the productive sector and people who work for the government, they're working, but they can't fundamentally pay the government debt. They're being paid by the government. So it's roughly 100 million people that are working in the private productive sector trying to service 32 trillion in debt. That's $320,000 for every person working in the productive sector. I mean, there's no way. This is absurd. On top of that, the problem is the dollar is irredeemable. When you pay a debt using irredeemable IOU, you're just shifting the debt around but not extinguishing it anyway. So when people look at the debt problem, I mean, even very prominent Austrian School of Economics say, well, they're going to solve it by inflation. But when you look at inflation as it's the process of borrowing more, you're in a hole. Inflation is digging deeper. You cannot get out of the hole by digging deeper. You'll never get all the way through the earth to the other side. It doesn't work that way. So how do you get out of this problem? How do you pay off the debt in nominal terms? How do you ensure the solvency of the financial system? Now think what you will of the banks and the insurance companies, the pension funds, annuities, right? There's a lot of different financial intermediaries in our modern system. Say what you will about them. If they were to all become insolvent, then everything that all the people think they have, their money, their job, their insurance, their pension, their retirement, their annuity, would all go poof, like a neutron bomb going off. So the goal is to repay all the debt in nominal terms. The goal is to keep the solvency of the financial system. And the goal is to, gold and silver do not circulate today. How do you get it to circulate? And so what I proposed is gold bonds as a mechanism for doing that. So a gold bond is like a regular bond, except the principal is denominated in gold, and it's payable, and the interest is also payable in gold rather than dollars or euros or whatever currency.
Mm-hmm.
So now when you pay a debt using gold, the debt goes out of existence. When you pay a debt using dollars, you shift the debtor. You're no longer the debtor. Now, whichever note you've used, that issuer of that note is now the debtor. So you're just shifting the debts around in the system. But when you pay with gold, the debt goes out of existence. You can tear up the debt contract. Payment has been made in full. A final payment has been made. So a gold bond is payable, can be completely extinguished. And what I propose in that paper is a mechanism to substitute gold bonds for paper bonds. The world is literally drowning in paper bonds. And that's the problem, right? As they proliferate, they're like a nuclear reactor that's a breeder reactor, or maybe a cancer.
Mm-hmm.
One of my themes is the dollar is a cancer. It grows out of control. How do you take all these, paper bonds that are outstanding and get rid of them? And I propose that the issuers who are in debt already issue a gold bond and say, okay, we're not trying to raise gold. So to buy the gold bond, you're not going to give us gold coin. We're not interested in gold coin. Nor are we selling this to rate. You're not going to pay in dollars. If we want to raise more dollars, we can sell more conventional dollar bonds. We want you to tender our outstanding debt and say, okay, you're going to go into the market and you're going to acquire somehow our existing debt, bring that back to us, and in exchange for that, we'll issue a new gold bond. And so it creates a market mechanism that sets an exchange rate between the dollar bond and the gold bond. Not the gold price. There's already an efficient market for that. But now the price of a dollar bond and gold bonds, which is the price of gold, let's say 10 years from now, it's a whole different story than what the price of gold is today. So what I think is going to happen is when people have a choice of two different bonds issued by the same issuer, the same entity, government or corporation that is obligated to pay, and the same term, let's say 10 years. One of them is a promise to pay, let's say, $190,000, and one of them is a promise to pay 100 ounces of gold. Mm-hmm. Which are people going to prefer? It's obvious, right?
Yeah.
Once you realize that, you realize that people will trade the paper bond at a discount to the value of the gold bond. So that is, people will bring more than $190,000 worth of paper bonds to redeem for a 100-ounce gold bond. And so this is a mechanism that serves the self-interest of the investing public, and it serves the issuer, because not only can the issuer get out of debt because it can pay the gold off and then the debt is extinguished, but it can get out of debt at a discount. It can reduce the nominal value of its debt outstanding, because people are bringing more and more of that debt outstanding for less and less gold to replace it. And so if you think about it and you fast forward that with each iteration, so you start out, you only issue a few gold bonds, obviously, and then you let the program grow as there's demand. With each new issue of gold bond, you're able to get rid of more and more paper debt in exchange for less and less gold debt to replace it. And then you can get control of your fiscal house and ultimately replace all the dollar debt with gold debt, and then actually pay off the gold debt and get out of debt entirely and get to a different, financial world than the one that we're in right now.
Mm. Yeah, fascinating. I've never really, I've never encountered this before, as I said before, but since there was kind of a novel idea to it, because it's kind of like shifts kind of like your way of perceiving debt and all that. I had a few questions that popped up. Is first, like the viability of the bond itself. So if we introduce those gold bonds, wouldn't that have then an impact on the current bond market, especially in terms of liquidity and interest rates? That was one part. And then also in terms of gold reserves, I thought even though then the amount of gold reserves is not as essential as I understood you when I read the paper, wouldn't countries then, but with larger gold reserve, have an unfair advantage on such a system?
Well, I mean, in a certain sense, that's like saying, don't people who have money have a certain advantage over people who are broke? Well, Yeah.
Okay, of course.
That's why you shouldn't be broke. That's why you should save. But this is really not about the size of your reserve. Rather, this is about your gold income. So, how much you have in the bank account's one thing, how much income you make every month is another. And this is really about using a gold income to serve as a gold debt. And so that as governments tax gold mines and other gold producing entities, they should be taxing them in gold directly rather than having the mine sell the gold to get dollars and then pay dollars to the IRS.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I mean, obviously countries that don't have any gold mining are at a disadvantage to those who do, but you've got to start somewhere. And, the monetary system is such a mess that, if you don't have any gold income and can't find a creative way to develop a gold income, then yeah, you're worse off than if you do.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And it also then poses the question, and I think you've kind of answered this over and over, so I'm not going to delve too much into the topic, but overall the gold standard, right? It's kind of like a recurring a theme. And I've heard in previous podcasts that in the wake of the current events that we have now with BRICS, the BRICS summit that we had recently, and the idea of having more and more gold-backed currencies, that in the end, also like in terms of, if we look at the market cap of gold being around 10 trillion in total, 10, 12 trillion, this would actually mean that we would need an event that reevaluates fully gold as a way to back either debt or level basically different central bank reserves in order to make this system viable. One of those theses has been laid out by Willem Middelkoop, a fellow a countryman here in the Netherlands that you might know, who has written the book The Big Reset. He's a proponent of such kind of scenario, and we've seen also like more and more central banks amassing gold in the recent years. What do you think of all that?
I don't think that you can retroactively declare a irredeemable currency to be gold-backed. And it's not a matter of how much gold you have in reserve. So I like to use an analogy. In the United States, for a long time during the so-called war on drugs, they were trying to do everything they could think of to get young people not to do drugs. And one of which is that when you go to the men's toilet, the urinal would have a puck at the bottom that says, don't do drugs. I can't imagine that had any effect whatsoever. So I like to ask people, how many urinal pucks that say don't do drugs does it take to end drugs? Well, it's not a matter of how many urinal pucks. You could have an infinite number of urinal pucks. It doesn't end drugs. How much gold reserves does it take for a central bank to retroactively declare its currency to be gold redeemable? It's not a matter of reserves. People have mistaken cause and effect. Obviously, during the gold standard, every bank that issued gold notes had gold on reserve, but they mistake cause and effect. So the problem is, in the gold standard, every unit of currency represents a deposit of gold. That is, somebody brought gold into the bank because they trusted the bank. They trusted the rule of law and got a piece of paper that said, we have your gold on deposit and we will give it back to you on demand. And so every unit of currency that existed, that's what it was during that gold standard. Now today, every unit of currency is created as irredeemable currency. It's not a deposit of gold. You don't have any customer gold on deposit, none. And you can't go out, I mean, banks in those days didn't buy gold, they accepted gold as deposits. You can't go and buy gold and say, see, we have a pile of gold, we have a pile of outstanding currency, roughly there is no right ratio. It's just like, what's the right ratio of urinal pucks to ending the drug problem? It's completely a non sequitur. So it doesn't work that way. It can't be done. And that's why this gold bond mechanism, it may sound complicated, it may sound elegant, it may sound complicated, it may sound both, but you have to have a market. In order for something to be durable, you have to have a market process that leads to that outcome. And if somebody just tries to decree, okay, we now have this amount of gold and now the dollar is backed at this ratio. And therefore, and this is very tempting for people who buy gold to think this, therefore, the government is going to have to declare that gold is $50,000 an ounce. And everybody who's got a couple of ounces of gold or more is greedily thinking, yeah, this is going to be great. Look how rich I'm going to be. And that's the temptation of this. But it doesn't work that way. And, you can't, you can't get that from here. I'd like to use the analogy. Everybody thinks of, if you have a bone, let's say you have there's 2 bones in your forearm, right? A bone is something that's a constant, it's a static thing, right? It has a certain length, a certain mass. And therefore the bone is unchanging, or so they think. But if you study biology, you realize that there are 2 processes occurring in every bone. One is the process of resorption, where the body is breaking down the calcium in the bone and putting it back into the bloodstream. And the other is the process of bone growth. There's living bone cells in the bone that are depositing fresh calcium. And those 2 processes are in equilibrium. That is, the rate that the calcium is being subtracted matches the rate that calcium is being added, and that's why your bone appears to be static. And if they're not balanced, like when some people get older, they have osteoporosis, and the rate of pulling the calcium out of the bone is faster than the rate that it's redepositing, then your bones become brittle and break too easily, and you have major health problems as a result of that. A gold standard where people deposit their gold in the bank, and they're also withdrawing their gold from the bank, has to be in equilibrium in the same way and for the same reasons. So today, if they retroactively declare the dollar is worth this much gold or the euro is worth this much gold, it's just a price fixing scheme. Every central bank or government price fixing scheme ever, without any exceptions, has always failed. And I think people understand when a banana republic says our peso is worth $1, that always fails very quickly, because as soon as the market doesn't want the peso anymore, that central bank is dumping their dollars to buy their own pesos back, and they always run out of dollars. And then they say the new value of the peso is 10 pesos to $1. It's always a losing battle. But 8 years ago, the Swiss National Bank was trying to keep the franc down, not up. People were buying the franc, not selling it, and they wanted the franc to be no higher than 1.3 francs to the euro. And everybody was dumping euros to buy francs. And so the Swiss National Bank said, we stand ready to print unlimited francs to defend this peg. And then a few weeks after Swiss National Bank President Thomas Jordan said that, the peg snapped violently. The Swiss National Bank lost 20% of annual GDP in a millisecond. And is when the value of gold is actually above whatever, $50,000, then the market will drain all the gold reserves. And then the central bank will either run out of gold and fail, or it will declare it's not redeemable anymore, or it will change the redemption price. And completely missing, getting back to anti-conceptual thinking, think of a dollar used to be a gold deposit. It meant you had a certain amount of gold on deposit. That's not something that's subject to change by policy. That's just simply a matter of contract. I gave you an ounce of gold, and you say you'll hold it for me and give it back to me when I need it. Well, that's not a price. That's just simply honoring. And if I don't think that you're going to give me back my gold, I'll never deposit it in the first place. And so some government declares that their currency is effectively a gold deposit, and nobody actually gave them a gold deposit, then nobody will trust it, and everybody will pull on it until all the gold is gone. So I just don't think it works even at a basic mechanical level, let alone look at the governments that people think are going to honor this sort of agreement. It's Russia, it's China. I mean, these are autocracies. To think that they're going to honor their word and do something like this, I mean, it's a fantasy.
Clear. But then they also one of the outcomes of that summit was the addition of new members that are, for most of them, big oil exporters as well. And overall, you could say it basically transforms into a commodity-driven alliance, right? If you believe that commodities are going to play a bigger role in the next decades to come, do you think that also currencies will be more and more used as well based on that fact? Meaning that if you talk about the yuan, the riyad, or that is pegged to the dollar in that case, but thereby they would need to unpeg from the dollar, or the ruble, or all kinds of other currencies that are in the BRICS alliance, basically determine new ways of then denominating commodities. Would you then say then it would go beyond maybe than just gold, but be commodities in general that are backing then those currencies?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conceptual issue there is, what does it mean to back a currency with something? And I think when you drill into that, backing can only really mean redeemable. And if it doesn't mean redeemable, then it just basically is a unverifiable promise. Trust us, we have this many barrels of oil held in reserve against our currency. And trust is going to be in short supply here, especially outside that country. So if India says, trust us, we have this much oil, is the rest of the world really going to trust that and trade in Indian rupees? So if it means redeemable, okay, great. But there's a reason why gold was money and oil is not. What does it mean to have oil as, redeem your currency for oil? I mean, it takes a lot of bulk of oil for the same, if this was a gold bar, or this is enough value to buy a pretty decent sort of near luxury car, the same amount of oil would be a decent sized swimming pool. And it's smelly and it's toxic and it's volatile and it's very flammable and it decomposes with sunlight or oxygen. So, if somebody wanted to redeem their currency and get oil, it's extremely impractical. I mean, you can't even store that stuff unless you have a licensed storage facility that's approved for all the risks and dangers of storing crude oil, right? So it comes back to gold, but it can't be done as retroactively declaring an irredeemable currency to be gold redeemable. As far as combining the currency some other way, I met a Indian gentleman who's in the jewelry manufacturing business in the Middle East. And the topic of the BRICS currency came up. And this is a guy who does not love America and does not love the dollar and is very patriotic to India and is very loyal to Prime Minister Modi. So this is definitely not an American just reciting the party line. And he said, have you seen the Indian chart of the rupee? It's lost, 60% in this amount of time. Have you seen a chart of the ruble? Have you seen a chart of the yuan? Seen a chart of the real? He said, so you're going to combine 4 small falling currencies into one big falling currency. He said, it's a joke. He was just laughing. And that's the problem is, in the world of paper currencies, none of them are going to replace the dollar. And they all may hate it. They all may not love the dollar for a lot of good reasons. But they're getting the short end of the stick. But the dollar isn't going to go away to another paper currency anyways. So you have to go to gold, but it's not going to be the issuers of today's paper currencies that wave a wand and say abracadabra, and now my irredeemable currency is now gold. Unfortunately, it's harder than that.
Yeah, well, it actually goes then back, if I resume it, to just redeemable, and that's what you said, and that might be then the most important concept to as a takeaway here. As a final comment, if you look at the way the whole system is organized, is there then a way that you would still see, given all we've talked about the gold bonds, about the fact that gold is the only actually exchangeable, retrievable asset here, that we then, in 10 years' time, if we talk again, and also coming back to what we talked about Utah and Arizona, that the world will not necessarily go into a full-fledged gold-backed system 101, but a gold-driven system, meaning that there's a whole infrastructure that will allow to trades or transactions to be settled in gold and so on, having different services, and also very similar to what monetary metals do with basically giving interest on gold reserve and so on, to basically have infrastructure that is more gold-oriented.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think that it's much easier to have an entrepreneurial bottom-up free market approach to give individual, whether it be savers, investors, productive businesses, to give them solutions that work, in a free market under ordinary contract law is much easier than trying to lobby governments to pass the proper set of laws to do this at the government level. Not to mention, gold is the money of a free market. To the extent that you don't want a free market, to the extent you want central planning, you don't need money, you need ration coupons anyway. I think that's much more likely, is that gold emerges, goes into use in the places that have the most urgent need for it, where the paper system is failing the worst. Gold will come in to fill the gap, and it will be entrepreneurial efforts, obviously such as ours, and probably other companies as well. That will grow, and then those companies will interconnect and federate ultimately, and form a monetary network that ultimately can provide a monetary solution to the world. Probably grow up in parallel to the government official paper currency regime.
Beautiful. On that note, on that gold note, thanks a lot, Keith. You've a website, keithweinereconomics.com, so make sure to check that out, because you have lots of those insights published as articles, and we can also follow you on Twitter. Thanks a lot for your precious time, Keith. I hope that we can have a next conversation in the coming weeks, coming months, about other topics where I would like to delve on, because my list of questions was much longer than what I actually asked you. But I've very much enjoyed this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Keith. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Leave your actions down below in the comment section. And if you want to watch more videos, feel free to check the most recent video, but also any other video that we've had published on the channel before. See you next time.